What's up, guys? Captain Blade J52 here, and it's been a pretty good amount of time since I was last able to get a budget tank guide or a guide like this out there for you guys, and there's been a good number of reasons as to why. Actually, there's been some personal stuff I've had to take care of outside of the game I am not going to go into details on, and there's also been some pretty major changes as far as the game itself goes, as to why I've not been able to get something like this or a full-on budget tank video out there. And the biggest reason is Season 13, that hit a couple of months back now. And as far as that stuff goes, one thing I will mention before we go too much farther, directly off to my left is actually a air conditioner and whatnot. Hopefully you guys can't hear it. If you can, like I say, if you can hear it and it's really loud, really bad, let me know, and I'll try to adjust the settings to screen that out, because I know you guys don't want to hear that thing running. Heck, I don't want to hear that thing running. But I'm recording from a very small room at the moment, and if I don't have this air conditioner going, there is the possibility that my computer probably could overheat, and even then it gets extremely hot in here without it. But I should have better recording conditions pretty soon, but in the meantime, gotta work with what I got. But like I say, do let me know if it's really bad and I'll try to fix it. But anyway, getting into some of the main reasons, some of the main changes itself, is Season 13. Now with Season 13, a lot of stuff changed within the game. I like to think a lot of it got changed for the better. There is some stuff that I didn't like with Season 13 as well. And one of the big things that I didn't like with Season 13 is that we lost the ability to do solo mode queues of certain instances. Such as, well, actually most instances actually lost the ability to solo queue, if not all of them. And that includes Starbase 24. And for those of you that may have seen one of my budget tank videos beforehand, you may be aware that Starbase 24 was where we tested our tank builds. We would clear everything from the first wave, which was just fighters, maybe one or two birds of prey. Then once it flipped over to that final wave, that's when the test would start. That's when I would flip the camera back on and everything, and that's when we would get down to the nitty-gritty. Because that's where we fought, you know, the Negvars, the cruisers, the birds of prey, the dreadnoughts, and pretty much everything at once. And that's how we tested our tank builds before. Well, with Season 13, some people refer to it as the Great Rebalance, some people refer to it as the Great Nerf, depending on who you ask, of course. But with that, with the loss of that testing grounds, there was no way for me to really continue on with the budget tank videos until I was able to line up another testing grounds of some sort, or until we got the ability to solo queue back. Now, I had been working with my good friend Timberwolf over at Timberwolf Productions, and as well as another good friend of mine, Artie. You may know Artie from the Pilot Review Show. Some of you may know him in-game as Omega Icarus. And I had been working with those two in order to line up a new testing grounds so we could get something going with the budget tank videos again. I know some of you seem to rather enjoy those and everything. A few people that did comment and everything. And I'd been trying before, whenever I was doing the budget tank videos, to kind of try to coincide with some of Timberwolf's stuff a bit. If he released a budget ship video on the Free Sovereign, cruiser that you get for leveling up as a Federation character, then I might, you know, after he released his DPS version, I might release one that was a tank version, so you could kind of get both sides of the spectrum a little bit. Now, in this video, I am going to touch base on a few items, a few things like that. And as far as that stuff goes, if you want, you know, more detailed explanations of everything, more detailed explanations of some of the items and whatnot, I would advise checking out the Intel Report series that I've been doing with Timberwolf. We've been going over the mission reward sets and examining them from the DPS side of things as well as the tanking side of things, and breaking down, you know, what they do, would we use them, and going into a lot more detail than what I'm really going to be doing here today. But anyways, check that out if you think that you want more detailed explanations of certain things, and also in some of the budget tank videos themselves, which I've got some stuff lined up for you guys. We're going to be doing those again, and we'll showcase some of that stuff as well. But anyways, getting into our main video and stuff today. Now, for those people who may be new to STO, maybe you're new to MMOs in general, and you're wondering, what's a tank? What's the big deal about a tank? Why can they be important to a group? And basically, what's all the hype about? What's the big deal? Why would somebody want to be a tank? Now, in traditional MMOs, something like World of Warcraft, or maybe even Star Wars The Old Republic as a couple of well-known examples, they typically follow, and even in some RPG games, they follow what's known as the Trinity system, or the Holy Trinity as some people refer to it as. And basically the Trinity system takes all of the different classes, everything within the game, and it divides them into 3 separate roles that they could fulfill within a group. Some classes can fulfill multiple roles, just depending, but anyways, the 3 main roles that the Trinity system supports are your damage dealers, or your DPS, there's healers, and then there's tanks. Now, your damage dealers are just what you would expect, just what you think they are. And the damage dealers, or the DPSers, it's their job, and DPS means damage per second, by the way. These guys are made to deal as much damage as they possibly can and to beat the living snot out of whatever you need to kill or you need to defeat. That's what they do. Their job is to pour on the damage so you can clear the encounter and defeat the foe. But the other job that a DPSer might sometimes do is, in addition to dealing damage to a foe, in addition to dealing damage to a boss, they might throw a crowd control effect out, such as in the case of a mage, they might throw a freeze on an enemy, or they might, in the case of a rogue, they might turn around and stun somebody. It really depends on the situation. Then you have healers. A healer's job is, again, just what you would expect. If somebody's health starts to get really low in a run, they heal that person back up to full, or as close to full as they can possibly get. And from time to time as well, healers may also purge certain negative effects from you. If a boss puts a damage over time ability on you, or a dot, then sometimes the healer might cleanse that if they're able. Then, finally, we also have the tanks. And a tank's job is twofold and everything. The tank is basically the shield that protects the group. You're the one that runs in with a sword and the shield and goes neener, neener, neener at the boss and makes sure that he tries to attack you instead of the rest of the group. So, as the tank, it's your job to try to protect the group from as much harm as you possibly can. So, you keep the enemy focused on you. That's the first facet of your job. That's the first face of what you're trying to do. Then, the second job that you have is you want to keep as much damage as possible centralized on you and not the rest of the group. Now, tanks typically have the most damage mitigation in the group. They have the best toolkit and everything to work with damage negation, to work with actually getting rid of damage, and various things like that. Basically, they're, like I said before, their job is to be the shield that protects the group. Now, STO doesn't really push the Trinity system. There's not really, per se, dedicated, oh, if you're an engineer, you're a tank. If you're a tactical, you're a damage. If you're a science, you're a healer. They don't really do that and everything. In fact, the tune that I'm on right now is a tactical-based tank character. That's what he does in space. But with STO, although they don't actually push the Trinity system, you are still able to build ships around the idea of healing, around the idea of damage dealing, and around the idea of being a tank. So you still can utilize elements of the Trinity system even if they don't actually push the Trinity system itself. Like, in my case, I prefer to tank. That's just what I enjoy doing. And in runs that I do with Timberwolf and some of the rest of the crew, I'm typically the one. I go in, I get everything's attention, they come in behind me, they mop up. That's usually what we do. Now, pretty much any ship within game, doesn't matter what ship it is, be it a tiny little escort or be it a giant dreadnought carrier, virtually any ship in game can be made into some sort of tank. Doesn't matter if it's the tiny little Aquarius escort or something as big as the Universe class Enterprise J. I've tanked in the Aquarius, I've tanked in the Enterprise J. It really depends on what you're looking for, what you're after. Now, there is no set in stone best skill setup, best traits, best tank, ship, energy type, none of that. There are certain items that will give you more tools to play with, but that's where what is best ends, as far as this stuff goes. Now, I'm actually in a Miracle Worker Tucker class at the moment. This is a ship I've had quite a bit of success with post-Season 13. But getting into what makes a tank, if maybe you think that sounds like something you want to try to do, is you want to protect the group from harm, you want to be that shield, where would you start? What's something you do? How do you do it? Well, a tank keeps the enemy's attention by being the person that has the most threat or aggro generation on the map. And in pretty much all games out there, NPC characters determine who they're going to attack based on how threatening that person is. How much of the threat stat are they generating? Now, threat is generated by the various attacks and abilities within the game. Some abilities don't generate threat, but for the most part, a lot of them do. And typically, the more damaging an ability is, or something along those lines, the more threat that ability is going to generate. This is just one hypothetical. An attack that deals 1,000 points of damage is going to deal more threat than an attack that only deals 100 points of damage. That's just typically the way it goes. And the more threat you have, the more likely you are to be attacked. That's why typically, especially in games like World of Warcraft, you want the person with the most threat to be a tank. That way, the DPS isn't getting their faces kicked in. Now, you've got a lot of tools to work with in order to generate threat in pretty much most, if not all, MMOs out there. Now, especially in STO, one of the easiest ways you can increase your threat or your aggro generation is to increase the amount of damage that you deal. Now, that's one of the ways you can do it. You can also use various other effects, such as one that we're going to look at here is your threatening stance. Now, this is something that all characters get, regardless of whether you're a science, a engineer, or a tactical captain. Everybody has access to this ability. Whether or not you have it activated or not is completely up to you. Now, in this case, for threatening stance, this is a free threat increaser, a free threat generation increase. So just by having this on, I'm automatically going to do 300% more threat generation than I otherwise normally would. Now, the base version of this is only 200% threat generation. We'll look at why that is in just a minute. But the first thing you're going to want to have to be a tank is you want to make sure you can keep the enemy's attention. And to do this, you're going to want to have threatening stance in your arsenals. You're going to want to have this activated. So in this case, I'm dealing 300% additional threat generation off the bat. So my attacks, by and large, are going to generate more threat, usually, than somebody around the same level of damage and everything. So I have this. This is free threat generation. I want this. This is going to help guarantee that the enemy is attacking me and not somebody else. Then another thing that you're going to want to look for, and this goes into picking the best ship for you. And there is no set in stone best ship type to tank with. You can tank in anything from as tiny as an Aquarius to as big as a Enterprise J Universe class or anything in between. Now, with a lot of ships out there today, you get what's known as cruiser commands or ship commands, and these are various effects you could toggle on or off depending on the situation. In this case, the Tucker class that I have, it's got 4 different things it can use. It's got the shield frequency modulation, which is a bit of shield damage resistance and regeneration for myself and allies nearby. I have weapon system efficiency, which is a weapon power cost reduction to self and allies, meaning my weapons are cheaper to fire in terms of power. Then we have strategic maneuvering. This is a flight speed increase for myself, meaning I can move a little bit faster, and a bit of flight turn rate for myself and nearby allies. This is good because I could potentially turn a stronger shield facing toward an enemy until I can repair the weaker shield facing, or so on. Then we have attract fire. This is a bit of a damage resistance increase while this is active. I know it says it's 1.2 seconds is the duration. That's actually a tooltip error, I believe. So you're always going to have this. That's essentially what I'm saying. Then, depending on how many allies you have close to you and everything, you can have an additional 7.5 damage resistance rating while that's nearby. Then, while this is active, you also have a plus 100% threat generation for yourself. So that is free, an additional 100% free amount of threat just by having this active, just by having this turned on. And it also decreases the threat generation of nearby allies by 50% while it's active. So, and this will stack with threatening stance, by the way. So by having threatening stance turned on, and by having attract fire turned on, and just the realm of threat generation right there, that is 400% the normal amount of threat that I would generate. So I'm generating 4 times the amount of threat that somebody at a similar damage level, similar gear, and damage level would actually generate. If he's generating, let's say, 5 points of threat, then I would be generating 20, and so on. So that's 2 abilities you're going to want to have as far as a tank. If you can get them, now you can get by without the attract fire command, it's not mandatory, but the one that you absolutely want to be using is your threatening stance. So that's a couple of ways that you can generate some threat. Now, the other things you're going to want to look at for being a tank as well is what type of skills, what type of traits, consoles, all of that stuff do you have. Now, as far as being a tank goes, there's 3 things that you want to take into account when determining if you think an ability could work for your build. And that's, one is, how could it affect threat generation? Could it give me a threat generation increase? Could this help me keep the attention of the enemy? If the answer is yes, then you could consider it. It might be something nice to have. Then the next criteria you want to look at is, could this help with my damage mitigation or damage reduction? You know, could it allow me to shake off that one super strong hit a little bit easier? Take some of the edge off of that super strong hit that I know this boss character is going to throw my way. Then the next thing you want to consider is healing. Could this, if I've been damaged to a certain point, could this allow me to get myself back to full a lot easier? Could this give me more durability and allow me to stay in the fight longer? That's the 3 criteria that I look at when determining if I think I could find use for a skill or not. And there is a 4th little criteria that I work with and everything. It's not as prominent as the other 3, but I look at it as, could this help me control the battlefield a little easier? And it's sort of a subset of the first one, in terms of, you know, will this allow me to keep the enemy focused on me? And that's, would the ability allow me to control the enemies better? You know, something like a gravity well, for example, and everything. A lot of science characters love to use it. It is a great damaging ability, but as a tank, it's also a great control-based power. It allows me to control the enemies, group them up, maybe pull them off of a teammate of mine. I crack a gravity well in the enemy, keeps them in place a little easier, maybe allows that teammate to duck back and get a heal off. That's just one example of something like that. So, We've established that you need to be able to keep the enemy's attention. Now, looking at skills and everything, this is another big thing as far as a tank goes. You want to make sure you have a decent skill setup and everything. Now, as far as skills go in STO and everything, they're pretty self-explanatory based on the tooltips and everything. Now, in STO, they're divided into 3 different types of skills. You have your engineering-based skills, you have your science-based skills, you have your tactical-based skills, just like the 3 career paths of captain you can pick from. Engineering-based skills typically focus more on technical aspects of the ship and things. They're more technology-based, they may have more innate hull healing, focusing on keeping the ship together. They may work more with your power systems and various things like that, and trying to squeeze as much out of the technology that you have as possible. Science-based skills typically focus more on the exotic type of things. You know, could we perhaps maybe use a chemical reaction to do some damage to the ship? Could we maybe tear open a rift in subspace and use that to slow an enemy down or deal damage to them? And they focus more on, you know, the sciencey solutions, for lack of a better word coming to mind, in order to deal with the given situation. They may have more control-based effects, you know, controlling the enemy through something like a gravity well that we mentioned before. They may focus more on draining the enemy power, something like along those lines even. And also they focus more on healing over time effects, you know, healing the shields, things of that nature. Then we have the tactical-based skills. Tactical skills, things like that, they typically focus on more martial strength, more military weapon-based power and everything. Tactical skills can typically get your weapons to be white hot, and to where it's going to sting and the enemy is definitely going to feel it each time you reach out and you smack them with a phaser, or smack them with a disruptor, or even smack them with a torpedo, you know, whatever it is that you're using. They focus more on attack patterns, you know, and just pure raw power and strength. That's typically, you know, what tactical does, as some examples. Now, down below you'll see, once you put enough skill points into an area, you start unlocking different things along these various tracks. Once you put enough skill points in to reach a certain area, you may learn how to train a certain ability for bridge officers and for other captains, to create manuals for this based on profession. Then you may also get a unlock where you get to pick from one of 2 skills. Now, on the tactical tree here, I've got this one in particular pulled up because out of all of these unlocks down below, I usually think of all of them as personal preference, because for the most part they are. However, if you want to tank, there's only one that I would really consider mandatory, and that is the threat control choice that you get down here. Now, you have a choice between hangar weaponry or threat control. Hangar weaponry, if you're somebody that enjoys playing as a carrier, then you might want to consider this. Otherwise, if you want to play as a tank, then I definitely consider this to be the better choice, is threat control, because that gives plus 100% additional threat generation while in threatening stance. It also allows you to lower your threat while you are not in threatening stance. So this is the ability that I mentioned earlier as to why threatening stance, for me, generates 300% the normal amount of threat versus the base 200%. So that's the one thing I would consider mandatory out of the skill tree. Now, you can place on these skills, you can invest up to 27 skill points into a certain school. You can invest, say, 27 into engineering, science, or tactical, and unlock what's known as the ultimate abilities. Now, at 24 skill points, you unlock the ultimate ability. You can invest an additional 3 points on top of that to unlock certain enhancements for that ability. Such as for tactical, if you were to invest 24 points into that, you would unlock Focused Frenzy. And you could probably read the tooltip there, hopefully. Mark the target foe and devote all available resources to taking them down. Each time you hit the marked foe with an energy weapon, the weapon's firing cycle will speed up progressively faster and faster. And then I could get additional enhancers on top of that, such as a stacking weapon bonus with each hit, weapon damage bonus. Allies firing on the target will also gain stacks of this ability, and so on. Now, I personally am not a fan of using the ultimate abilities and whatnot, although you can use them in a tank build. I personally do not recommend it, because in my personal opinion, you have to give up far too much in other areas to justify their use. And again, that's just my personal opinion on that. If you're somebody that uses the ultimate abilities and you found success with tanking, then that's great, that's wonderful, and everything. It's just for me personally, for the way I like to play, they're not really my cup of tea. Now, as far as the skills go and everything, this is just the build that I personally have found success with. There's other builds out there that you can utilize and everything, but I'll go over these skills and everything because this is part of the basis for the character itself that you're going to be playing as. Depending on what skills you have, it's going to determine some of the bonuses that you get, which could affect your weapon strength, which in turn, as far as tanks go, could affect your threat generation, could affect your healing, could affect your damage negation, all of that stuff. So it's important that you have this in a proper working order that is going to benefit you the most. Now, as far as the Lieutenant tier goes, I have points into hull and shield capacity. I have 2 points into each of those, because that's going to give me an additional health pool to my shields and to my hull that I can work with. Then I also have a point into shield restoration and hull restoration that's going to increase my base healing a good bit. And I don't usually invest more than 1 point into that, because there's other stronger heals, better benefits that I could get elsewhere. And I don't think that just increasing the base healing like that, at least out of the skill points, is a wise investment beyond 1 point. Then we have the Advanced Energy Weapon Training. This is free damage that you get by maxing this out. This is going to be a threat increaser as far as tanking goes. Then as far as the Lieutenant Commander stuff goes, you have improved EPS flow. This is another thing that I picked up. This increases my power transfer rate. It can allow the power to come back more quickly after I've used certain powers, and so on. Then we also have Impulse Expertise. This gives a bit of speed to our builds as well as some turn rate. This is going to allow us to get to certain areas faster. This is also going to allow us to turn the ship faster. That way, if say our shields drop on the left side of the ship, we can maybe point the shields on the forward arc of the ship toward the enemy until we can redirect shield power and so on. Then I have points into the control expertise. I've maxed that out for improved control expertise and drain expertise. This is going to allow me to control the enemy a bit better and keep their attention a bit better through use of control powers, and perhaps even lower their damage through draining based effects. Now, we have targeting expertise here, and we've maxed this out because as of Season 13, there was a slight accuracy penalty introduced to firing modes such as Beam Fire at Will and Cannon Scatter Volley that allow you to hit multiple targets at once. And this helps us to overcome that penalty a good bit. And accuracy rating, it's good to have this. It's good to make sure you can hit your opponents, because if you can't hit them, you're not going to be able to keep their attention, you're not going to be able to deal damage. So this is one reason why I have this. Then for the advanced defensive maneuvering, I have this as well, because this is going to make our ship a lot harder to hit by having this. So in this case, this makes it harder to hit. That way we can maybe shake off some damage and get away from it. Then we have our 3 points for the hull platings. Just by having these, you get free damage resistance to a ship. So that's always great to have. Then we have improved shield hardness. This is a damage negation to your shields just by having this. Then we also have the weapon amplification and specialization. This is going to translate to free critical hit chance, free critical hit severity. So that's going to increase our chance to get a critical hit and increase the damage of the critical hit, which in turn translates to, again, greater threat and keeping the enemy's attention. Then you have the defensive subsystem tuning and offensive subsystem tuning, which is free power to all of your subsystems, just by having this active. And then there's a point that you could put into each of the individual subsystems to get additional power that way. Then we have points into the exotic particle generators. Now I only have 2 on this particular character and whatnot, but this allows me greater damage through exotic-based powers. And I do use a couple of science powers in some of my builds sometimes in order to keep the enemy's attention. Some of the science-based powers are what we call zero-distance powers, and we're going to look at what that means in just a minute or two. But then we have long-range targeting sensors. This offsets the maximum distance penalty for our weapons. Basically, this means the farther you are from the enemy, starting at around 2 kilometers out to the maximum engagement range of 10 kilometers, your weapon damage starts to drop off and become a little bit less. This reduces that penalty to a maximum of minus 20%. So that is something to be aware of. Then, as far as the other two, you have hull penetration or shield penetration. Now, if you max out the hull penetration, it's a total of plus 10 armor pen, which allows you to ignore 10 points of their armor rating. Then you also have the advanced shield penetration, which allows you to deal an additional 5% total shield bleed through. Now, shield bleed through basically means this. If somebody is attacking you and they're hitting your shields, if they're dealing, say, 100 points of damage per hit to the shields, that means that normally, because the standard shield bleed through is around 10%, this means that 90 of those points would be absorbed by the shields. The other 10% is going to bleed through to the hull. This increases that by 5%. So in this case, an additional 5 points would bleed through, so to speak, in that case. So if, say, they're dealing 100 points of damage to your shields, now 85 is going to be stopped by the shields, and an additional 5 points, meaning 15 points, will bleed through to the hull. So this is percentage based, keep in mind, but you can actually make arguments for either one here. And I've heard arguments for both, so as long as you've got one, you're doing great. For hull pen, you could say, well, this allows you to bypass some of their armor, therefore you're going to do more damage and threat generation that way. And then a counter argument to this would be, well, if you can't get through the shields, then you're not going to be able to hit the hull. And that's a fair point to make. And on the flip side, shield penetration, you could say, well, this allows you to get through their shields faster and to deal more damage to their hull and that sort of thing. Counterpoint to that argument is, well, what happens when the shields drop? Then this doesn't really help you. And again, that's also a fair point that you can make. So there are points you can make for either one. There is no right or wrong answer to that. Finally, we have a point in warp core potential. This is free power to all of our subsystems, and it does stack with the previous power generation that we have, so that is very nice. And then you could further specialize into something such as warp core efficiency, which gives more power to a subsystem the lower it is, and various things like that. Now, these last 2 points are what I would consider optional. You don't have to have these 2 specifically, but I like to use them because I think they're very nice. Then we have Shield Mastery, which negates an incoming critical hit once every 20 seconds. And you'd be surprised how often that actually has saved my rear end. Then we have Shield Absorption. Whenever I am critically hit, up to 20% of that critical hit gets applied to me as shield healing to all facings. So if, say, somebody hits me for a critical of 200 points of damage, then that means I'm going to get 20 points of shield healing applied to each facing. So that's essentially 80 points of shield healing that I've now gained off of that total. So pretty decent stuff all around. And then you could further specialize into things like specs, which we have Pilot. I use this mainly for some of the bonuses it gives as far as turn rate. as far as immunities, allowing me to move the ship easier. We have strategist, which can give certain benefits depending on whether or not you're in threatening stance or not. And since we're in threatening stance a lot, I usually like to use this one. And then a new one I've been working on that they've come out with is actually Miracle Worker. Gives a lot of nice healing bonuses, things like that. So the three primary ones that I work with are Miracle Worker, Pilot, and Strategist, and everything. You can mix and match to do whatever you need to do and everything, but that's just some of the ones as far as the back end stuff to look at. As far as your traits go, again, it's kind of the same situation. Could it help you stay alive in terms of damage negation? Could it give you healing potential? And could it allow you to maybe control the enemies a little better, keep their attention? And also, will this allow you to increase your threat? And as an example of something that is a heal and a damage reduction, we have a Blade of Shell. This is going to allow me to stay in the fight just that little bit longer. Then we have something like the beam damage that you get for free. It's bonus weapon damage to my beams. So this means that my beam-based weapons are going to hit harder, which in turn translates to greater threat. Same thing goes with the Starship traits and the Space Reputation abilities. Is it something that's going to increase your threat generation or allow you to keep the enemy's attention? Is it something that's going to allow you to potentially shrug off damage and give damage reduction? Or is it something that's going to allow you to heal? That's some criteria you're going to want to consider. An example of a really good trait I would recommend to anybody right now is the Honored Dead trait. If you're able to pick this up, this is worth 10% damage reduction to you as long as it's active. Once it gets stacked up and once it's active, this is a very powerful tanking trait that you're going to want, in my opinion. An example of a good trait that increases your threat generation by, of course, increasing your damage. If you're able to get a hold of it, it's Emergency Weapon Cycle. This comes from the Arbiter and Battlecruiser bundle, if you're able to get a hold of it. It increases your weapon cycle haste and reduces weapon firing cost. Then there's All Hands on Deck from the Presidio from the Command Cruiser bundle. This is a recharge time reduction on science-based powers, which can give some healing or control, and also on captain abilities, which could, depending on what you are, this could be extra damage for threat. This could be extra healing. This could be extra control-based stuff. It just really depends. Now, you could use pretty much any trait, any of this stuff, as far as benefits and everything. But that's the criteria you're going to want to look at as far as your traits and that stuff goes. Now, getting into the ship itself, selecting your items, your energy types, that sort of thing. Now, there have been some changes here to items that I would recommend. And one of the biggest changes involves the embassy consoles that used to come from, or that still do, come from the Romulan embassy. Now, I think, do I still have one on me? I do not have one on me without going back and getting it from the bank. But anyway, if you were somebody that tanked beforehand, you probably utilized what we call the plasma exploders from the Romulan embassy. It was a plasma generating weapon signature amplifier in the case of a tank. This would increase your threat generation as well as offering a plasma explosion that could bypass the enemy shields and go straight to their hull, which in turn it gave you threat generation in the static sense, that it gave a passive boost threat generation, and it also gave you an attack that bypassed shields, damaging the enemy, therefore allowing you to keep their attention a bit better. Now, as of Season 13, those have been changed. The damage no longer bypasses the enemy shields, so it does next to nothing in terms of damage now, and it's basically little more than a passive threat generation stat stick at this point. Now, in terms of tanking, you can still use them because they will give a passive threat generation boost, which is nice to have. But on its own, I don't think it's enough. to justify using a full-on console space anymore. To me, there's too many other consoles that give far greater benefits than just that. And it comes down to a case of why have one benefit when you could have two or three from something else, if that makes sense. Now, as far as choosing your energy type goes and whatnot, there's no set-in-stone best energy type within the game. You know, there's anti-protons, there's disruptors, there's phasers, there's plasmas, there's polarons, and I believe I said disruptor? But anyway, anti-proton, disruptor, phaser, plasma, polaron, and tetraon. That's your basic energy types that you have to work with. And there is no set-in-stone best out of those energy types. I don't care what anybody says. There just is not. Now, each of the energy types are within 1% of damage to each other, so fairly balanced. The only real difference between them is the proc, or the ability that each of the energy types would give, and what you can have backing up said energy types. Now, you can make a tank using any of the energy types. In this particular case, for this ship, I chose to go with Tetraon, because I can get some various shield stripping abilities. And some of the procs on the weapons could be something very nice to work with as a tank as well. In the case of these, the diffusive Tetraons, they debuff enemy shield resistance, they buff my shield resistance. So that's one reason why I wanted to include a couple of them in the build. Then we have the standard Tetraons. They drain enemy shield facings, which allows me to get to their hull and the team get to the hull a lot quicker. That's just some examples of why I chose this specific stuff. And also because I could pair it with the anti-chronotons and get a Tetraon damage boost. So hopefully you guys can see what I'm going for here. Why I chose this specific stuff. This is going to increase my Tetraon damage and everything, and how everything's pairing together. This is going to give me greater threat because I've got this set bonus stuff to draw from. And these are things you're going to want to consider as a tank. You know, how does everything combo together at the end of the day? How can you best put everything together? Now, as far as ship consoles and stuff go, there are a few that I like to consider and everything, especially on the budget end. And since we don't typically use plasma exploders anymore, one that if I do want to pull a fleet console that I do like to consider a lot of times are the restorative particle focusers. They come in different varieties. This one in particular has Drain X and EPG, and it can give an exotic damage bonus whenever I pop a healing ability, as one possible example. So that's an example of something that could translate to additional threat if I'm using an ability that is exotic damage based, in this case a gravity well. Then there's consoles like the Trillium Deplating, which gives free damage resistance rating as well as maximum shield capacity. So this particular console, it buffs my damage resistance rating and it buffs maximum shield capacity. So I'm getting two benefits there. I'm getting something that's going to allow me to take more hits or larger hits in terms of the capacity, and something that's going to allow me to shake off damage a good bit. So that's an example of a console that you might want to consider. Now, speaking of armor consoles, one thing I do want to mention is that damage resistance rating in this game, and this is a mistake that I see a lot of tanks making, and I'm going to cover this a little bit more, but towards the end of the video, but the big thing I will say is you do not need to stack armor consoles in order to be a tank. It's not strictly about damage resistance rating and stuff that you have. You know, the stats, I guess the best way I could say this is it's not necessarily the stats you have that matter as far as your shields, as far as your hull and everything. It's your ability to maintain those stats that matters the most. Now, as far as items go, similar things. You know, can it increase your threat generation and allow you to keep the attention of the enemy more? An example of some items that I like towards the higher end of tanking, and also damage dealing if you're somebody that is You like to deal a lot of damage. If you're able to get a hold of them from the low-buy console market, or from the low-buy consoles, is the tachyokinetic converter. This increases your turn rate and gives some critical chance and severity. This can translate to greater threat generation for tanks, as well as greater control of the ship. Binaural infusion circuits gives a bit of hull capacity, some control expertise, and some critical severity. So this can allow me to control the enemies a little better. This gives me a very big boost to critical severity, which is a huge boost to threat, and also increases my hull capacity a bit. Then we have the Assimilated Module. This is something you can get from the reputations. It's free critical chance and free severity, as well as a bit of damage control, gives passive hull regeneration, and control expertise, allowing me to control enemies a bit better. This is some examples of what I'm talking about. Read each console, read the tooltips to see what they do. Now, we're going to touch base on the shields, the engines, the deflector, and everything, because this is arguably a very big part of the ship itself, and an important part at that. Now, if you're going to tank, I typically divide them off into 3 categories, usually. Everything 3 to 4 categories. In my brain, I'll have to write all this out on a table for you guys at some point and get that out there to you folks. But I typically divide them off into 3 or 4 categories as far as tanking. And the criteria for being what I would consider a tier 1 tank set, being the best of the best, is it excels in the 3 areas. It excels in at least 2 of the areas while giving a pretty decent boost to the third. Can it increase my threat generation, allow me to keep the enemy's attention? How is it as far as damage negation? Does it allow me to shake off a lot of damage? And how much healing potential does it give? Can this allow me to recover from a massive hit that I may have been dealt? In this case, what I still consider to be the number 1 or a tier 1 tank set in game is the 4-piece Kobali set. Now, if you have access to the Kobali Samsar, this is a set I will strongly recommend to anyone. Actually, let me get a little drink of Gatorade here. I was getting a little parched there, but anyway, the Kobali set in this case, why I place it at a tier 1 is because of the damage negation it gives, the healing potential it gives, and it could potentially allow me to stay in a fight a little bit longer. Now, in the case of the Samsar, now if you can't get the Samsar, then there's other sets I would recommend. As I believe at that point, if you're only using the 3-piece Kobali, there are other sets that outclass it, and I'll explain why that is in just a minute. But if you have access to the Samsar, either you were there to get it through the anniversary event and get the account-wide unlocked version of it, or you're able to get the ship from a Phoenix Prize token, however you've gotten a hold of it, then I would strongly recommend you give this set some consideration. And reason being is because of the benefits that it gives. You can see an example for the shields. It's a Res All shield. This is what it comes as at the moment once you get it to Mark 14 Epic. And I'm going to kind of mouse over these really quickly because I'm not going to go into super great detail. But like the engines, depending on my engine power level that I have, I can get some Bridge Officer cooldown reduction, which can translate to greater threat. It can translate... it could translate to greater healing potential, which allows me to stay in the fight longer. Could translate into perhaps maybe even some damage reduction as well, and even greater threat. It just depends on how it goes. Then we have the deflector here, as an example. It's going to give me good healing. It gives me some sponginess, I guess, as well as a bit of control expertise, which allows me to control the enemy better. But then we have the Warp Core, which is an amp core once you max it out. And, well, at Ultra Rare, I should say. This is going to increase threat generation, which is going to allow me to deal more threat overall to the enemy. So, it excels in damage negation, It excels in healing potential, allowing me to recover from hits, and it gives a pretty decent boost to the third area. So this is why I consider it a Tier 1 set. But the big strength to the Kobali set is in the Warp Core and the Regenerative Integrity field that also comes with the Samsar, with the Kobali items. Now, the big strength to the Warp Core here is the shield capacitor that it gives. It's a huge boost of shield regeneration, instant shield regeneration to yourself and nearby allies, and it's on a 4-minute recharge. Now, if your shields drop, I have seen, especially with myself, and depending on, your shield capacity anyway, I have seen this take all 4 shield facings that were depleted on a ship and restore them back to full just by popping this power. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think this could also be increased by... Yeah, so this actually can be increased by shield restoration. So if you pump into shield restoration, you're going to get more benefit out of this. So that's a major strength to the Kobali set. Then we have also the 4-piece bonus, which is, I've got it on the bar over here, it's an activatable. It's the reactive nanite screen. When receiving energy damage, nearby allies and yourself receive whole healing equal to 20% of the incoming damage for 15 seconds. Now, I have used this, and in some cases gone from near death back to full just from this power alone. So it offers great healing potential. It offers, well, great recovery, I should say, / healing potential. It offers great damage reduction, and it offers some threat generation as well. So it touches all 3 areas, excels in 2 of them, and gives something to the third. So that's why I consider this a Tier 1 set. Now, another example of a Tier 1 set would be something like the Lucari. This gives a good chunk of upfront damage negation, and also could give some additional damage and everything by debuffing the enemy resistance. So it excels in damage negation, and it excels in being able to give potentially additional threat to you. And it doesn't really give the greatest amount of healing potential, but it still gives something to it. So that's why I would consider this another Tier 1 set. Now, some examples of Tier 1 items would be something like the Regenerative Integrity field. I'll touch base on that real quick. This is another reason why you're going to want to pick up the Samsar. It's a very huge burst of healing, and energy damage you deal to the enemy for 10 seconds is going to be applied to you as healing, with a maximum and a minimum. So that is something to be aware of. And then a rival to that would be the Protomatter Field Projector from the Lucari Science Ship, which is increased regeneration to yourself and to nearby allies. And I have seen in some cases, for example, a Starbase Fleet Defense. The base was nearly dead. I saw 1 or 2 people pop this, and the base is back to full. So this console in and of itself can be a real piece of work. But that's some examples of what I would consider a Tier 1 set. Now, if you don't have access to the Tier 1 items and everything, then there's other sets that you can utilize as well. And that's what I would consider a Tier 2. To be considered a Tier 2, it excels in one of the 3 areas, either threat generation, damage reduction, or damage recovery / healing. It excels in one of those 3 areas. It does moderately well in the second, but it doesn't really do much for the third. So that's what I would consider, and that's not to say that the lower tiers aren't good, it's just that they don't offer as much as the higher tiers do. An example of a Tier 2 set would be something like the Soul Defense set. It offers great potential in damage negation. As you can see the shields do here. It gives great damage negation and everything. It gives increased healing as well. You can see this particular stuff. Turn rate and defense rating, making you harder to hit. So, and then we'll take a very brief look at the set bonuses here so you can see what I'm talking about. Offers damage reduction just for having it equipped, and then offers a heal as the 3 set. So it excels in damage negation, and it does pretty great in healing. but it doesn't really give you much in terms of threat generation. So it excels in 2 of the areas, essentially, but not the 3rd. So that's why I consider it a Tier 2. Now, an example of another Tier 2 set would be something like the Iconian set here. Now, the Iconian set is one that a lot of DPSers like to use. A lot of people still use it from what I see. And in the case of the Iconian set, it gives great upfront damage negation. And with its set bonuses, take a quick look at those. You can see it can direct the shield facings a bit. And it also gives increases to damage, especially the 4 set. But it doesn't really give much in terms of overall healing. So it excels in damage negation, and it excels in potential threat generation, but it doesn't give you much in the terms of damage recovery. So that's why I would consider it a Tier 2 set. Then we have stuff such as the Temporal set, as one example. We'll take a quick look at the set bonuses on it. Now the Temporal set, you can see the set bonuses here. Increases damage over time effects for some stuff. It also does physical damage, so it gives a good bit of threat generation. Now I'm kind of going over these really quickly. Like I said, I'm not going to go into too great of details on some of the items, just touch base on them a little bit. But it offers pretty great upfront damage negation and upfront threat generation, similar to the Iconian set. So that's why I would consider this perhaps a Tier 2. Then we have stuff like the Jem'Hadar set, getting into the Tier 3 sets now. And the Tier 3 sets, they typically excel in one area. They may touch base on the second area, but they don't do anything for the third. In the case of the Jem'Hadar set, as one example, it gives great upfront damage negation and a little bit of threat generation, but it doesn't really offer anything in terms of healing potential. So that's why I would consider it a Tier 3 set in this case. So, and again, this is just how I break stuff down personally. You know, people can feel free to agree with me, disagree on all this if they want to. But that's some examples of things to consider. And that's not to say that that's not to say a Tier 2 tank set or a Tier 3 tank set can't be good, because they absolutely are. It's just a matter of what do you think would work best. Now, the Jem'Hadar set, in the example, if you're a Polaron user, this is going to give great upfront damage negation, and it's also going to give a bit of boost to your Polaron weaponry. So it is something to consider. It excels in one area while offering a bit of threat generation as well. It's not the greatest amount of threat generation, but it's still there. So that's some examples of some stuff that I would say. And as far as the Bajoran set, it could give decent damage negation and whatnot. This one, I've still not decided what category I would put it in yet, especially since it can be re-engineered. The base set itself, like I say, I don't want to commit it to a category just yet. But this is another example of some other sets and everything. But anyways, that's the shields, the engines, the warp core, that stuff. I know I kind of went on a side tangent and a rant explaining that. But that's some stuff to consider. You know, what does it offer in each of the three areas? What does it offer you as far as threat generation? Can it allow you to keep the enemy's attention? What does it offer you in terms of damage negation? Will it allow you to shake off some of the big hits, or will it not? And also, what does it give you in terms of damage recovery? You know, how well can you use these items? How well will they let you recover from a very big hit? That's some stuff to consider as far as your shields and your engines and everything. But finally, as far as your bridge officer powers, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty. Now, as far as the stations on this particular ship, you have a Commander Engineering / Miracle Worker, a Lieutenant Commander Tactical, Lieutenant Commander Universal, meaning you could slot any of the 3 base professions in it. You have a Lieutenant Science / Miracle Worker, and then a Ensign Engineering. So as far as the ships themselves go, and everything, you want to take into account your bridge officer seating and also your starship masteries as some stuff you might want to consider when deciding what type of ship you want to tank in. You know, as far as the starship masteries go, I typically prefer some with the cruiser masteries because, I fly a lot of cruisers. In this case, for the Starship Masteries, I have damage reduction and absorber full plating, which is more kinetic and physical. I have rapid repairs, which is free healing. I have enhanced hull plating, which reduces energy damage, which is again free damage resistance rating. And armored hull, which allows me additional HP to work with. And then finally, of course, we have the trait. Now, the traits for Tier 6 ships, once you unlock them, they're yours to keep forever and everything, even if you get rid of the ship. So, that's some examples of stuff you might want to consider. And then, I actually have it on me, and everything, is the Crimson Force Field that come with the ship. Now, some ships come with consoles you might want to use as well. This is basically a AoE cone, the Crimson Force Field is. And it reduces enemy weapon damage and healing received if they get hit by it. Now, I'm not using the Crimson Force Field, because I believe I get better benefits from some of the other consoles. And it's not to say that the Crimson Force Field is a bad console by any means, because it is definitely a great console. It's just that, again, it's a trade-off to me. It's a case of, why have one benefit when I could have two or three, and everything. In the case of some of these other consoles I have on the ship, they give healing benefits or threat generation increases / damage increases, and they're easier to control, easier to work with. And, that's just me anyway. But, anyways, as far as the mastery goes, pretty much all Tier 5U and Tier 6 ships will have this. They will have some form of mastery and abilities that you can unlock that are passives just by having the ship. And then as far as your bridge officer powers go, now this is the heart and soul where a lot of your abilities are. And these are the powers that you're going to be using. These are the activated powers that you're going to use to enhance your weapons, throw your heals if you need to, and everything. And this is a core part of the ship. Now, I like to use ships that give a somewhat of a balance of all of them. They give me at least 3 tactical powers, they give me at least 3 engineers, and at least 2 science powers. That's the ideal breakdown in my opinion, is they give at least that. Now, I prefer a more of a balanced approach and everything, that way I can adapt to the situation if need be. And plus, it just, in my opinion, something like this Miracle Worker ship, it just gives more of a balanced approach, like I was saying, and it gives me more tools to work with than sometimes other ships may do. Again, that's just my personal preference. Now, I have the tactical team power. This allows me to redirect my shield facings and everything, as well as purging certain debuffs, so it allows me to stay in the fight longer. Then I have the attack pattern beta. This debuffs the enemy, which can lead to increased damage. I have Fire at Will 3, which smacks anything within range with a beam just about it while it's active, so that can in turn lead to greater threat generation and everything. I have Emergency Power to Weapons. This increases my energy weapon damage as well as gives weapon power, which in turn, greater threat. Then I have stuff like the Gravity Well, which is a 0 distance power and a highly threatening power, as well as a control power. Now, a 0 distance power basically means this. In terms of threat generation, it's the most threatening of a power that you could possibly get versus an outright taunt. Now, 0 distance power basically means this. As far as the enemy is concerned, you're right on top of them. So even if you're at the 10 kilometers range and you smack them with this power, as far as they're concerned, you're literally right on top of them. And you're going to be generating a lot more threat than normal. And Gravity Well, it's a nice damaging power, and it's a lot of control and everything. And I like to have a Gravity Well on my tank builds if I can get it. Again, that's just me. Subspace Vortex does pretty decent damage to the enemy. I believe this one was also a 0 distance power, if I'm remembering my powers correctly. There's a lot of powers and everything, so sometimes it can be confusing as to what's what. But then we have a damage reducer, such as align shield frequencies. This is one of the specialist seats and everything. We have narrow sensor bands, which can increase threat generation by a good bit and increase damage. We have reverse shield polarity, which is a heal. We have engineering team, which is a heal. Hazard emitters and science team, which again are heals. So you want to play it off with a balanced build that can give you good access to all areas. You want to be able to increase your threat a good bit when you need to. You want to be able to heal when you need to. You also want to have stuff that could potentially reduce your damage when you need to. So I guess what I'm trying to say is you don't want to gimp yourself in any one area. As far as builds go overall, I like to think of it as sort of a spectrum. You know, you can go... I like to think of DPS and tanking on a spectrum. One side you've got pure DPS, one side you've got pure tanking. And if you get too far into the side of DPS, or damage dealing, and you could maybe consider that threat generation. If you get too far into the DPS side of things, you could, now this is as a hypothetical, let's suppose you had a ship that could deal 900,000 points of damage every single hit. But at the same time, because you're so focused into damage dealing, if the enemy so much as sneezes in your direction, not even sneezes on you, but sneezes in your direction, you're going to die. That's what I call a glass cannon. And you can't deal damage if you're dead, so it's not really going to help you any. Then, on the flip side of that, you could get so focused into tanking and not dying that you're basically an indestructible turtle. And everything. You know, the enemy, no matter what they do, is never going to break through your shell. They're never going to kill you. But on the flip side, you don't have enough damage and enough threat generation that you're not going to keep the enemy's attention, and you're not going to kill them either. So it's a draw at that point. So I like to keep things more towards the middle of the spectrum, with a bit more leaning towards the tank side of things, if that makes sense. So, anyways, that's as far as that goes. And the big thing I will tell people, we're going to take a quick look at some misconceptions as far as tanking goes, and then we're going to kind of wrap this up. Now, some of the big misconceptions that I see a lot of new tanks doing, heck, I did it when I first started out, and that's the idea of armor stacking. They think, oh yeah, I've got to get, you know, all this armor, all this damage resistance, and they may have, like say in this case, I've got 4 engineering consoles. They may throw all 4 engineering consoles full of armor, and they think, yeah, I've got this great damage resistance and all that stuff. And that is true, they do get some decent value out of it. But the reason you don't want to do that is because armor consoles and stuff like that have diminishing returns, which basically means they scale non-linearly. So the more of it you have, and the more of it you add, the less and less effective it's going to become up to a certain cap. Now, if I remember my numbers correctly, and I may not remember them exactly right, so don't get mad at me if I don't remember this exactly correct, but from the way I had always been told, for your first armor console, it's typically face value. If it says 25 points of damage resistance, that's what you're going to get. For the second armor console, you're only getting 50% of the value. So you're getting half of what it says combined with the full 100% of the first console. The third console is going to give you 25% of the face value. The fourth console is going to give you 10% of the face value. And then depending on how much damage resistance you have at that point, the fifth console is going to give you 5% of face value or nothing at all. Now, I won't swear to it, those numbers are still exactly the same as that, but that's what I was told back in the day. So, anyways, I'm sure some people could figure out the exact numbers, but point being, there is still a diminishing return. And not only that, you can get damage resistance from different ways than having to slot consoles. And if you get your damage resistance like I do through a lot of traits, through a lot of passives, things like that, that frees up your console slots for something that you could devote to healing or to increasing your threat and allowing you to stay in the fight a heck of a lot longer. Now, and this is not to dog armor consoles or to rip on armor consoles and everything. They definitely have their uses. But what I'm saying is don't overdo it, I guess, and everything. But the other misconception, like I was saying, is that people think, oh, well, I can make the enemy attack me, therefore I'm a tank. It's more than just keeping the enemy's attention. You have to be able to survive the attacks too. If you could just make the enemy attack you instantly, but you're getting your butt handed to you in 1 or 2 hits, you're a glass cannon. On the other hand, if you can, be somebody that just never dies, but you never kill the enemy either, you're an indestructible turtle, like I was saying before. The final misconception I want to look at before we wrap this up is the idea that it's all about, purely your shield capacity and purely your hull capacity. Now, you can see on this particular ship and everything, as far as overall hull, once it takes skill modifiers, all that stuff into account, I'm sitting at 91,762 hull, which is fairly decent for a cruiser like this and everything. And I have 15,621 shields in each of my facings. That's the maximum amount of shields I can hold. Now, some people have a lot more than that, and that's absolutely great. That's wonderful. That's cool. But a mistake I see a lot of people thinking is, oh yeah, I've got like this, this 100,000 shields or this 250,000 hull and everything, and that's absolutely cool that they can get that, don't get me wrong, but how can they maintain it? That's the next big question, like I touched base on before. Can they maintain it? You could have this is a hypothetical. Let's say you had 500,000 points of hull and 500,000 points of shields. That's cool that you could get there, yes. But if you can't maintain that, if you can't keep that 500,000 points of hull and shields up, then it's basically a countdown until your death at that point. And it's not really doing you any good. You're basically a sponge, and once they've exhausted through all those points, then you're dead. But anyways, folks, I hope that gives a basic information of, what is a tank, why is it important, or why can tanking be important, and why would you want to try it. And this was just to get some basic information out there to you guys, touch base on some of the stuff you're going to want to consider, all of those things when building a tank. Now, in the budget tanking videos coming up that we've got lined up, we're going to look at building an actual ship. We're going to actually test some of the ships on the budget end. Such as far as the budget tank videos go, we always take into account, okay, you've got a hold of the ship, but now that you've got a hold of the ship, you don't really have a lot of resources left, so how can you make it work? We usually work with the bare bones levels, which is, 2 million EC, and that's it. Everything else has to be free. We work with mid-range, which is, we assume maybe 30 million EC, and then enough to lithium to get one single item to epic. Then we also assume, getting, in the case of high-end, we assume that you've gotten access to a little bit more high-end gear and everything, typically not a limit on EC at that point, and you're pretty well established in the game. But, anyways, guys, I hope you found this video somewhat informative. If you've got questions about anything below and everything, please let me know. I'll try to answer them as best that I can. And if you've got a budget tank you want to see me do, let me know in that area, and I'll see what I can do for you guys. But for now, folks, this is Captain Blade J52 signing.